Hello,
Oh,
it has been a while. We are back at the Polas. I am Matt, and we have Chris and McKay here joining us today. And today's topic, we are doing sci-fi pathogens. Um, yeah, so it should be a good discussion we're going to do today. McKay is going to kick us off.
yeah. So I do want to talk about a little bit about my background. So my background is I have a bachelor's degree in integrated studies. It's a bachelor's of science in biology and geology. Um, I have done my own research on pathogens, and I know the biological mechanism behind pathogens. So, with that being said, I kind of want to mention that the big thing that we're going to be wanting to look for in all of our pathogens, transmissibility, right? How transmissible? What is the side effects of the virus? I also want to see what is the mortality rate of the virus and virulent is it? Um, all of these things will determine whether or not it is viable in a real world setting. Second, I want to kind of touch on, and I will touch on this after we go through our viruses. I gotta want to talk about COVID. And we just got out of the pandemic. People are still getting sick with COVID. It is around, but now it's being considered what is called not a pandemic, but an endemic. COVID is here to stay. It's like the flu, it's like the cold. We were in a pandemic and now it's endemic. So I'll talk a little bit about that at the conclusion. So, with that being said, I'll kick things off. So, I'm going to kind of get into character. And I will give you a hint at what my virus is, and I'll have you guys guess it. Our business is life itself, the slogan of the Umbrella Corporation. What famous virus did Umbrella come up with? And it started the entire Resident Evil franchise. The T virus. My one of my favorite sci-fi pathogens. So let me talk about the background of the T virus. So in the Resident, I'm going off of the games for Resident Evil and the animated movies. So the origin of the T virus, you have a scientist by the name of Oswald E. Spencer going into Africa, and he finds this flower. And this flower, I think it's called a sun ascendant something. I can't remember the name off the top of my head. I'll have to read through the lore. And this flower had a symbiotic relationship with a virus called the progenitor virus. It is the virus that started Oswald E. Spencer's company, the Umbrella Corporation. And several experiments around the progenitor virus went on from the 1950s all the way up to even today, according to the lore of Resident Evil. But before that, we have Resident Evil Village that I do want to mention briefly. And it kind of, Oswald E. Spencer went to this town in Transylvania, or this village, and
Yep.
met
Yeah.
Mother Miranda. And Mother Miranda was experimenting with a fungus called the megamycete. And the could do parasite when I'm which if you implanted in a host gave them physical abilities, cognition, what have you. Not that's another topic. We can go down that rabbit hole a different day. But he got inspired. So after that, he goes to Africa, finds progenitor virus, builds the Umbrella Corporation. Okay. And he produced several superhumans called the Wesker Project. Albert Wesker, the villain Resident Evil, came from that project. Um, but let's get to the formation of the T virus. So the T virus is unique. It took the genetics from the T virus from the progenitor virus, and it crossed it with that of a leech, produced the T virus. The T virus is short for Titan, or not Titan, tyrant virus. And the tyrant virus is responsible for the Raccoon City incident, and the incident at the Arclay Mansion, as well as the Arclay Mountains incident. So I want to kind of talk about the T virus. So we know, so it is a human-made virus. Okay, we got the genetics out of it. Let's talk about how it is spread. So the T virus is actually not spread through the air. It is spread through bodily fluids, blood, flesh, saliva, sexual fluids. Just warning, yes, I went there. But in terms of transmission, it is important to note how viruses spread. And that is how the T virus spread. But once it infected a person, it had an incubation period of about 2 to 12 hours, depending on the individual, depending on the individual's genetic makeup. That would be a huge determining factor. When fully incubated, it did not kill the host. That is important to note in the lore of Resident Evil. It does not kill the host. But they enter this zombie-like state where their flesh is kind of corroding because of hemorrhages that are going on inside the body. So you do get this zombie-like appearance with the T virus, but they're not dead. They are alive, but the person has no control over what they are doing. They are just going off the basic instinct of what the virus is doing to them, which is the virus wants them to feed. And the more people they infect, it is able to spread. It is important to understand there have been other outbreaks of the T virus in Resident Evil lore. However, it is not as, it's one of the most terrifying viruses in Resident Evil. However, it's not as terrifying as the C virus, which is another virus that has descended from the progenitor virus. I think we need to do a Resident Evil episode.
Because the C virus could actually raise the dead.
Yes, C virus can raise the dead, but T virus can't. T virus has to infect living tissue. And the T virus was used to create not just, in fact, humans to be the zombie state, but it also transformed people, depending on the genetic makeup, into bioorganic weapons, such as the lickers, such as the tyrants. Okay, in nature, all of this is totally science fiction. The T virus, the only thing that would be equal in real life to the T virus that I can think of is rabies, and it is the rabies virus. But the rabies virus does not have the incubation that the T virus has. It actually takes a long time for rabies to incubate. It takes approximately 2 weeks to a month for the rabies virus to incubate. If you were bit by a rabid animal like a bat, for example, you won't experience rabies symptoms right away. That is why if you bit by a rabid animal, you go to the hospital right away, and that's why they do a series of shots in your abdomen after being bit by a rabid animal. So, with that being said, the T virus can't raise the dead, and it doesn't kill the person. Eventually, the person will die, right? After the virus runs its course, the person does eventually die with the T virus. But it is also important to know, if you look at the zombie aspect, Rabies has that aspect with rabid animals. It causes this change in their psychology that deep on a neurological level where it forces them to go feed. The T virus does the same thing. It is also important to note that the T virus is spread through bodily fluids. It's not airborne. The C virus is airborne. So you can't really spread the T virus. There is this point in Resident Evil, if you look at the show, it shows that it's airborne infection for the T virus. In the games, it's not airborne. In the games, the comics, and the animated movies, the T virus is not airborne. It is spread through bodily fluids. Similar, I would say the spread of the T virus is very similar to that of Ebola for the rate of infection. But it has a much faster incubation period than Ebola, right? Where if you were to look at the Ebola epidemic in 2014, whole villages in Africa got wiped out because of Ebola. That is possible, but the incubation for Ebola was so long. That is why Raccoon City fell in a matter of days, is how fast the incubation period for the T virus is. I would say, based on the rate of transmission, and other factors, it is plausible. It is, but it's not the most plausible on your list. We already talked about what was on our list. So with that, I'm going to turn it to Matt, who's going to talk about something that is more plausible than the T virus.
Great. First off, I apologize for a little bit of a raspy voice. I am currently getting over my own virus right now. So the virus I chose was the Crippen virus, also known as KV for short. Is from the I Am Legend 2007 movie. I just have it open right here, some background information. So it was originally developed as a cure for cancer by Alice Crippen, who, but so the cure did not work, obviously, if you've seen the movie, and it mutated. It pretty much gave people like body dysmorphia, like and really intense surges of adrenaline that like gave them durability and enhanced speed and stamina and all that. And it says here, KV at first appeared to be effective at no side effect, but over time the virus began to mutate and cause rabies-like symptoms in it. So kind of similar to what you were saying. But this virus actually became airborne and wiped out 5.4 billion of the population. So I is also in Manhattan, which is way like super populated there. So imagine trying to contain something like that went airborne that quickly. So I personally think it's very plausible. Could definitely happen. Um, yeah, that's kind of my take on that. I do think psychologically it would take its toll. Like you see the movie where he was stranded there by himself and going crazy at some parts, talking to mannequins and whatnot. But
What's interesting to note about both the movie and the novel is that the infected people or eventually eventually formed into primitive life forms of their own. They were still almost human in behavior, formed tribes, and even had families. They hunted him because he was hunting them for specimens, which was interesting because it implies a mutation of the brain itself beyond just the rabies symptoms.
right,
And what is important to note, the psychological aspect. I forgot to talk about the psychological aspect for the T virus outbreak of Raccoon City. Um, what the main character went through in I Am Legend is loneliness. A lot of his psychology was driven by the loneliness of the situation.
It wasn't just that. I mean, he pretty much lost his family, right? So he was
Yeah,
severely depressed. He had anxiety, all that. So it was a lot more than just loneliness, especially when he lost his dog there. Like as a pet owner myself, I can imagine going through something like that and having to
yeah,
put them down yourself.
and there the a lot of some of his psychology is very reminiscent of Chris Redfield in Resident Evil in a lot of ways. Chris went through Raccoon City, went through the Arclay Mansion, went through the Arclay Mountains, um, went up against Albert Wesker multiple times in combat. He felt like he lost his sister at one point. He didn't know where his sister was. Um, and it turned Chris into this kind of gruff character. And what you see in Resident Evil Village is now he's kind of like he wants to stop the war. He wants to stop the battle against bioweapons.
Yeah.
And he's going against not just Umbrella, but he's also going against the Biosecurity Assessment Alliance or BSAA.
And a huge part of that character development came from Resident Evil 6 when first he lost almost his entire team, which he felt was entirely on him. He was the team leader. He was supposed to keep them safe.
Yeah.
And then later he told his partner he was going to retire. He was going to promote him to his position. And then the partner dies.
And the partner dies in a sacrifice of himself to save Chris.
Yeah.
When Resident Evil 6 was initially written, it is important to note it was actually supposed to be Chris that died, not the partner.
Yeah.
That's pretty much all I have to say about the Crippen virus. I think is actually
it has a lot of
it's super plausible.
It is super plausible, and it has a lot of similarities to the T virus in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And yeah, I initially thought about talking about that virus, but I dropped it. The Rage virus from 28 days later and 28 weeks later, which is literally just as they explain in the movie, a mix of Ebola and rabies. So
Oof.
it's yeah, it's basically rabies with a much faster incubation period, and then the bleeding from the orifice is like Ebola, which makes it much more contagious because it's easier to get infected blood on you.
Yeah, it says here for the Crippen virus, it had a 90% kill rate. That was insane. And like only like 12 million or something were immune.
I need to look at the kill rate for the T virus.
Yeah. Anyways, Chris, you want to talk about yours?
Oh, right. So for mine, I'm talking about something that has deliberately on the creator's part not a lot of information. The flood from the Doctor Who episode Waters of Mars. Now there isn't a lot of information on the I'm going to call it the pathogen, even though it's technically a parasite, I guess, because the episode revolved more around the emotional theme, but the pathogen itself, it arrived in a glacier on Mars. The setting of the episode is that in 2059 there is there's a research team based on Mars. They built a base around one of the poles, and they'd been using the ice cap there as their primary source of water. One day, their water filtration system got busted, and the day after that, some kind of infection arrived through the water. The infection completely changes its host. The mouth and the teeth all turn black, and they start producing water endlessly without without any stop. They're constantly wet. Yeah, I'm not gonna make a joke there. They're constantly looking like they just stepped out of like they just climbed out of a pool. And they infect others just by getting water on them. And they can expel water from any part of their bodies, either their mouths or I'm not even sure if it's from their sleeves or from their hands, but they can just blast jets of water like they're a fire hose, which sounds silly, but it makes them basically invincible because you can't really outrun water. And yeah, there are what, 10 people in that crew. I think 3 people actually survived that base, and the only way to contain the infection was to nuke the entire base. The water, if they're if the zombies are locked out, they keep blasting until they build up enough pressure to just break a wall or door down with pure water pressure. And they seem to have a hive mind, an intelligent hive mind, because they only activated when they saw how to control a shuttle meant for Earth. When they saw how much water is on Earth because Mars is drying up. And yeah, they originally shot a lot more expositional scenes, and then they cut all of them because they thought the mystery of what the hell is going on would be scarier.
Hmm.
And yeah, I don't know how plausible it is because we don't know anything about the possibility of life on Mars. We do know that there might be water on Mars. We have seen some sign of extinct bacteria from Mars. So yeah, that's
Yeah, no, I do think there are some kind of life forms on Mars, but to what extent, I'm not sure.
yeah.
Uh,
So
I wouldn't rule it out
I
completely, saying it's not plausible because it very well could be. But it's
I
certainly interesting for sure.
I'm gonna kind of do a scientific conjecture here, if I may. There's still water on Mars. As far as bacteria on Mars, there is still possibility that there are primitive bacteria on Mars. We don't really know. There are some ongoing missions right now with some probes that are looking at that very aspect. They found some chemical traces in the soil on Mars that indicate there still might be, something there. I want to make a quick correction to my point. The T virus was airborne under laboratory circumstances. And it was, and when what happened in Raccoon City, I forgot to mention, it was primarily due to the Raccoon City reservoir being contaminated by samples of the T virus.
and rats that got infected.
And rats. So I want to say that makes it a little bit more plausible for how fast Raccoon City fell. And the containment aspect of it, the government had to nuke Raccoon City, but I would like to kind of do, I think, a full Resident Evil dive is due for later in the poll list. Matt, if you're game for that.
Yeah, we could do that at some point.
Yeah.
Yes, Chris, when you were talking about Mars, the first thing, because we talked about earlier about Doom, and that was where my mind went at first. And when you talk about the water people there, is for some reason my mind went right to Smallville in the early seasons. The
Yeah.
people, all the high school students had like the most bizarre abilities.
Oh, yeah, totally. I mean, these are basically zombie waterbenders from Avatar. That's basically the best description of them.
Yeah.
Except we never actually see them eat people. We just see them infect people, which, yeah, I mean, one of the most horrific ways we see them infect someone is when a doctor goes to check on his teammate and he forcefully pushes him down, and it looks like he's trying to drown him by just pouring endless water over him.
Mm.
And then another incident is when we see a guy get infected because there's a lot of pressure on the ceiling, and then one drop falls right into his eye, and he just goes into a panic because he knows they don't die. The infected don't die, but they essentially lose everything about themselves, all their individuality.
Yeah.
And yeah, what's interesting is that out of the people that get infected, we see we see four men get infected and two women. The men all mutate in such ways that their eyes go completely white. The only thing except their pupils goes white. But the women, their eyes remain the same. They remain more human, which initially makes one of them think that one of the infected is still human because if for a second she spoke before her voice became all distorted, and then suddenly she stopped speaking altogether because like originally they meant for her to have a speaking role, to be a mouthpiece for the infection, but then they decided it'd be scarier if they didn't speak at all. Instead, they just scream, which is a lot more horrifying. And remember, Doctor Who was originally it's supposed to be a family show, which makes this episode even more bizarre. It didn't even air on Halloween. It aired in November. So yeah, it was weird.
Yeah, I think we kind of ties into like that psychological part that we talked about. Like we mentioned about the water dripping into the guy's eye, like
Mhm.
just that instant fear of oh shit, like this is gonna happen now.
Yeah, I mean, I think the scariest thing about this episode isn't the infected people. It's the idea that if there is an infection in the water, in the pipes around you, in every bit of water around you, liquids are everywhere. It's really hard to avoid getting any liquid on you. So yeah, it's actually pretty horrifying to think about.
Yeah, definitely. We are just about out of time. I think out of the three, I do think the coronavirus is probably the most plausible.
Probably.
Um, Probably the T virus after that, and then the water one because
Yeah, definitely.
it's bizarre to me.
Yeah, because the water one is something out of H.P. Lovecraft. It's because it's sentient.
Yeah,
It has plans, which is yeah,
it
I mean
has.
that's I mean
All right. I do want to take 1 minute, if I may. We just got out of a pandemic, so this episode is very fitting. And one thing I kind of want to talk about is thank you to all of the front lines people who have been who have been there at the start of the pandemic, who continued to work in our hospitals, the EMTs who risk themselves day in and day out to go take COVID patients to the hospital. Um, the doctors, the nurses who are treating COVID patients. Thank you to all the scientists out there whose intellect and determination to come up with a vaccine for the SARS-CoV-2 virus and its variants. And thank you to all the people who worked in the front lines that are not healthcare providers, the retailers, the teachers. We could not have made it through this pandemic without you. We do this episode to kind of talk about the science fiction aspect, but it is important to know that we just came through a very massive pandemic, a once in probably 250-year pandemic, if not more. Last count, I'm going to pull this up right now. Worldwide COVID cases, according to Johns Hopkins University, confirmed cases of COVID, 688,269,375 confirmed cases of COVID since the start of the pandemic in 2020. And now it has been a little over 3 years later. We have had 6,874,311 fatalities. The numbers could be more, but it is important that, we just came out of a pandemic and kind of talk about, these infections. So on that, I will just say, trust the science on it and trust what you're doing and talk to your doctor about these things. And on that, I will close.
All right. Thank you for tuning in. We will come out with another episode. This will be uploaded this week. We'll come out with another one a couple days later. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and comment down below your thoughts on our pathogens that we chose, ones that you think of, whatever floats your boat. And signing off from the Polis. See you guys soon.